Welcome to Carlisle and Team Chevy. If you want to hear me ramble a whole bunch about the LT7 engine, pricing's not announced yet. Hey, you're the first person to ask it. That's all you want. I don't know. Yeah, all good. So, welcome. My name's Dustin Gartner. I'm a small block assistant chief engineer. So, if you want to hear me ramble about the LT7 for a while, I'm going to try to do that. This will be a little free form. So, if you want to jump in or I confuse somebody, please let me know next year. So, with that, to kind of get a little bit of backstory between the LT6 and the LT7. I know when the LT6 released, we told all of you it was part of the Gemini engine program or the Gemini project. It was always back to the ties to NASA. NASA always, the astronauts always drove Corvettes. And the Gemini part of it at that time, we told everybody, was because of twin throttle bodies, you know, twin manifolds, flat plane crank runs like twin 4 cylinders. That was just something we made up at that time because we couldn't tell you about the LT7. We named it the Gemini program because of the twins. The LT6 and the LT7 were co-developed from the beginning. One didn't exist without the other on paper, and we initially did the layout for both engines and kind of conceptualized what they were going to be before we got into the details back in the fall of 2015. So the LT7 has been about 9 years in the making in the background, and it's pretty exciting to finally be able to talk to everybody about it, because it's been hard to keep this one close to the chest with what it does and what you guys all saw. So I think everybody here knows we're talking about 1,064 horsepower. It makes that power at 7,000 RPM. That's on its way to an 8,000 RPM redline. It's 600 RPM lower than the LT6, but I'll get into kind of the nuts and bolts behind that as I go through the engine details. Really the thing that you drive and that impresses me is the torque curve. So at 3,000 RPM, you're already over 800 foot-pounds of torque. And it'll manage that torque over 800 foot-pounds to almost 7,000 RPM. At 7,000 RPM, it's about 795 foot-pounds of torque. And peak torque comes in at 6,000 RPM at 828 foot-pounds. So that linear horsepower growth across that flat torque curve is just unrelenting acceleration. It's literally boot in your chest. Sort of power, and the way the car pulls from a watt, like at 80 miles an hour, is like most on a standstill. It still pulls over one lateral G's forward, you know, if you stomp on it at highway speed. It's how much more acceleration and power you have on tap. So with that, how do we get where we are here? So with the LT6 and the LT7 being the twins, as we call them, they are still both the Gemini family. 5.5 liter flat plane crank. They say that they share the same engine architecture, but the LT7 is not an LT6 with turbos on it. So what is the same? The block casting is common between the two. We designed the block structure for the LT7 loads. There's just a few additional features in the block we machined to turn it into an LT7 block versus an LT6. There's some ports for oiling and cooling rated to the turbos. All of those casting features are on every LT6. The other thing that is pretty similar is the lubrication system. So I think we've all heard about the LT6, awesome, you know, race-focused lubrication system. We have 6 scavenge stages in that engine, 1 for each of the 4 crank bays, then 1 for each head, and then the front cover ties into one of the heads on that. The LT7 adds a 7th scavenge stage. So between the 7 scavenge stages and the 1 pressure pump, we have 8 oil pumps on this engine. That 7th stage, what it adds is direct scavenging of the turbos. So the turbos are packaged very low on the engine and in the car. So with that, you can't get the oil back from gravity. So in true race car fashion, right, we're going to actively scavenge the oil away from the turbos. But the other fun fact about that 7th scavenge stage for the LT7, that's essentially in every LT6. That 7th bay is in the oil pump. We just put spacers in it, not gears. And then all the internal passages for those turbo feed and return lines are in the lower crankcase of every LT6. Once again, getting back to the fact that this isn't an afterthought. They were designed together to be together. From there is where the LT7 starts veering away from the LT6 obviously with the amount of power we're putting through it. The crankshaft is, I say nearly identical. It's the same steel forging. There's some additional machining we do on the front and rear counterweights, and that's due to the big changes as we start to work our way up the engine. So the LT7 has a unique connecting rod. It's 4.5 millimeters shorter than the LT6, and I'll get into why in a minute. And then as you come up the rod, it's still forged titanium, connecting rods like the LT6. The small end or the pin end is much bigger to support a bigger pin, and that section of the beam on the rod is much thicker. We're working our way up to much higher combustion pressures. Moving up into the pin then, the pin is both bigger OD and it's smaller ID. So bigger and thicker. It feels like a socket in your hands. It's so beefy. Then moving our way up to the piston, obviously drastically different piston. We have a much longer skirt, pin structure to support that bigger pin, obviously in its weight. And then the LT6 piston has a pronounced dome on it. Part of the way we're getting it up to 12.5 to 1 compression ratio on the LT6. The LT7 is what you guess would be the opposite of that. We have a dish piston that's also thicker. So when you go thicker in dish, you've moved the underside of that piston down lower as it relates to the crankshaft. That's why the rod is shorter, because we had to move the pin down to make room for that piston meat that's up above it. So with that, in conjunction with cylinder head changes, we dropped the compression from 12.5 to 1 down to 9.8 to 1. So way more boost friendly to do what we're doing to it. The other half of the story to get to that lower compression ratio is the cylinder head castings for the LT7 are completely unique to the LT7. They do not share head castings, and we do that for several really good reasons. One of the initial ones, obviously, is the combustion chamber is much bigger on the LT7. That's the other half of getting the compression ratio down as much as we did. The other thing we did is we reconfigured the intake ports a little bit, and that's to enable the way the intake manifold is mounted on the LT7, and also the fact that we have additional port fuel injectors on it. We needed clearance for that spray plume on those. And then the other really big change is on the exhaust side. The LT6's exhaust ports are very evenly spaced, and they're starting to turn the gas flow up. So we're trying to direct it up into the tubular headers that are on the LT6. The LT7 is doing the exact opposite. So if you look at the head, even the outer two exhaust ports are starting to pull inward and curl down. So, and that is then feeding into the turbo, which I'll get to. Let me take one step back to the cylinder head. So after the exhaust ports turn, and the other thing, the combustion chambers, entire intake ports, and exhaust throats are all 100% CNC machined like the LT6. So the heads are like jewelry and just perfectly smooth and controlled. The valve train in the heads, this is where they're very similar together. They carry the same rigid mechanical finger follower system that's in the LT6. That's all here in the LT7. Obviously the cam lift profile and timing is shifted to be more optimized for boost versus optimized for naturally aspirated. But the general layout of the valve train and the timing drive, that is where the engines are common there. So back to the cylinder head where we're turning the gas flow inward and down, that is guiding it into an integrated single piece casting turbine manifold assembly. So the hot side of the turbo is part of the exhaust manifold. And if you sneak down in there and see it, it's very compact. So what we're trying to do there, one for packaging, is two is we're getting that turbine wheel only a few inches from the exhaust valve, factoring into base engine design for anti-lag, right? So that exhaust gas immediately gets to the turbo. You put the turbo 2 feet away, you have that much more distance to get energy to the turbo to then start turning that into turbo speed. It's a big, heavy cast stainless steel part to survive the temperatures. We can have exhaust gas temperature excursions up to almost 1900 F. And in order how to wrap your mind around what that means, the analogy we like is it's almost 2/3 the temperature of the space shuttle's reentry tiles is what we see in the turbine housing at peak power. And to further enable that to survive, the turbine wheel is made out of a Mar alloy. So that's one step above Inconel in temperature capabilities. It's a high nickel content, really exotic, vacuum sealed cast piece. Just, it's as good as it gets the material there to survive in that environment. So that turbine wheel is a 67 millimeter turbine wheel that translates that engine through a center ball bearing housing. Another good feature for anti-lag. Ball bearings housing, very low on friction, which means any of that energy going to the turbine wheel is going into acceleration. You're not losing it with friction with the ball bearing turbo. That feeds into a very large 76 millimeter ported shroud monostroll turbo. The compressor wheels are significant. And we spin them up to, it's about 138,000 RPM. And at that peak turbo speed, the tips of the blades are about 1.7 times the speed of sound. Just to put things in weird context of really how much this engine is doing, what's doing there. So some other good features with the turbos, because we want to use all the turbo and we can't overspeed a turbo, we have turbo speed sensors. We know the speed of the turbos at all times and we control to that. We also have electric wastegates and electric blow-off valves. Those allow us to do some pretty trick things in dynamic driving. Actually, I'm going to get to all the anti-lag stuff here in a minute. I want to finish a few engine parts because they factor into this. So, out of the compressors on the turbos, those feed up to on-engine intercoolers. You can see them there in the cutaway. They're the big silver blocks right on the valve covers. So now our intercoolers are only a few inches away from our compressor wheel. We're keeping that turbo tight, the charged air path very tight to the engine, and then that intercooler then feeds directly to a throttle body, which is only a couple inches away, which feeds into an intake manifold that has drastically less air volume in it than the LT6s does. The LT6s we're trying to get, naturally aspirated tuning waves to get to the power that does. We don't need that with a forced air induction system. We want low volume and intake so we have less air to compress. So we're keeping that boosted air volume very low so we can build boost quickly. And then in addition to that, the intake manifold is completely separated left bank to right bank. There's no communicator valves like we have in the LT6. Once again, we're not trying to do any tuning or crosstalk there, but it allows us to boost control the engine by bank. So it closed loop boost control left bank, right bank individually. So it really operates as two 4-cylinder engines. So then back into the various stages of anti-lag, because I know that's what everybody talks about with turbos on that. So part of the base is everything I just talked to in the base engine design that gets you a really good start of having really quick response, fast boost building. But we do a couple other trick things in operation. We have one mode we call steady state, anti-lag, and dynamic anti-lag. So if you're in a state where you're at an elevated or higher than cruising RPM speed and light throttle, read that as maybe somebody would think about doing a roll race. The engine doesn't need to be optimized to operate there efficiently, this or that. We'll actually move the phasers into peak scavenging. We'll get the electric wastegate pre-positioned. So as soon as you ask for something, all the actuators are ready to immediately command full boost. And then in addition to that, then the really significant one is the dynamic anti-lag. So in a dynamic driving situation, read that as a track. You know how the C8s work. They know when you're in that sort of driving state. And you come off power, braking zone, corner, what it have be. So your throttle's closed, your fuel's off, your engine braking through a corner, so you're still moving air through the exhaust. Because we have electric wastegates, turbo speed sensors, and pressure sensors, we actually go into a closed loop boost control while you're off the throttle. So we will carry turbo speed, read that is boost pressure, through that braking event. So all the way up at the throttle, you already have higher than atmospheric pressure ready to go as soon as you come out of the corner. So in a track environment, there's virtually no lag at all. It's really quite magical, and our performance drivers have just been tickled with it. They say it's not a turbo engine on the track. I guess while we're talking to turbos, this little bit of history, and some people might ask, well, why'd you go turbos? Corvette, small block have historically been superchargers. Superchargers are great for what they do, but they were the right solution for the previous generations, where this is the right solution for this one. Why? The packaging on the front of a car is drastically different than what we can do in the mid-engine. The mid-engine architecture enabled both what the LT6 and LT7 do, because the engines are very tall and the LT7 is very wide. You can never put a externally mounted twin turbo engine of this size in the front of the car or between wheels, or let alone between wheels you actually want to turn. So we were essentially always packaged out of doing a turbo. The only option you could do is a hot V, but there's a ton of disadvantages with doing a hot V, from thermal management, hood clearance and things like that, which is why supercharging was always the right answer for all those applications. But moving to the mid-engine enabled us to move to turbos, which gets you the other benefit of turbos. They are drastically more efficient than a supercharger. If you look back to the previous generation ZR1 LT5 with 755 horsepower, awesome beast of an engine in its own right. However, on that engine, you're 160, 170 horsepower going into running that blower at peak power. So effectively, the crank train of that engine is processing 900-ish horsepower. So inherently, when you want to get up to these power numbers, to run a supercharger, you're probably another 200 horse you need going through the crank train and everything else with that. But with turbos, you basically steal the free energy from the exhaust. And then we address the only other negative concerns with that with anti-lag is with all the modern technology we have with the e-wastegates, the creative algorithms, the turbo speed sensors, to really make it a linear driving experience as the load comes on. It's really quite magical how it all works. What else we talk about? Oh, the other thing, the LT7, like the LT6, is going to be built in Bowling Green at a performance build center by our skilled craftsmen there. That's truly a magical place for me, being an engine nerd, to see that being made. And another part of the LT67 and the PDC, we would never be able to do engines like these without those folks and the way they build engines there. Typical manufacturing constraints we have on higher volume small blocks, right? We're trying to build thousands of those a day on a line, tool access clearance. When you have a single builder building it by hand, he's only building 2 a day. You can have more intricate assemblies, violate a lot of our more stringent manufacturing rules, which you have to do to build an engine of this complexity. So it's a bigger part of the team there that really makes all that happen. I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of stuff. Oh, and the power rating. That's all SAE, per the procedure done, 93 octane. There's no need to get E85, you don't need to go get race fuel, you don't need to get a special cal from the dealer. Everything we stated on that is there from the factory, pump premium, you're good to go. No games there. It's a legit number. What else is cool? I don't know, maybe we'll dive into Q&A and then I'll... Suspension? I'm the engine guy, but I can probably find somebody. I'm sure we can hook you up with some people afterwards that I could say some stuff. I don't want to go there. Talk to those guys. I'll say something wrong.
Have you had a ride in it?
Oh yeah, driven them for a while too.
How is it?
It's what you expect. That's just the terms we come to that don't have an explicative in them. Is unrelenting, boot to the chest. It's ballistic. We don't have those numbers, so the performance numbers we have been stating is it'll do the quarter mile in the 9s, and the trap speed will be around 150. So that kind of puts that in perspective.
What's the oil spec?
The oil spec, it's identical to the LT6. Service fills 8 quarts, 5W50.
Is there room for more of those 76mm turbos?
The turbo, so the only difference in the loop system is the lines of the turbos, and they are small lines, and there's only a little bit of volume of oil in the turbo. So the amount of oil in the engine between the two is fractional. So
Power-wise, 76mm.
make more or take more? Well, if you look at the torque curve, so we're flat from 3,000 to, and 7,000 is where the torque starts falling off, and that's where our peak power is. We were completely turbo saturated at that point. That's wastegate flows. That's why at 7 to 8 we start rolling down a little bit. And I guess that sparked another good thing to talk about. So the red line move between the 6 and the 7. Back to what we had to do with the piston, the pin, that rotating mass is heavier. To get the LT6 up to 8,600, because everything with energy and forces is, the velocity term is squared, right? It gets exponentially harder every 10 RPM you go up from there. So all the mass we had to add into those parts obviously brought it down, but if you also look at the power curve, the way the turbos are sized, we didn't want to shift where the torque comes in above 3,000 RPM, because then you got a big dead zone. And there's a balance there that our turbos are saturating at 7, but good 1,000 RPM to 8, so your shift points, you can still just do this back and forth over peak power.
Is there any concern with heat issues operating like track environments?
So the question is around track cooling. So obviously you can see on the ZR1, the front of the car is drastically different. So we've added a lot more heat rejection capability to address just that, to make the car as bulletproof on the track as the Z06 is. And you look over the car over here, the two big radiators in the center, the Z06 just had one shorter one there for engine cooling. So we stacked two much larger ones. The rear one is the same, it's just that it's more bulk engine cooling up with the horsepower. But the front one is dedicated to the charge air cooling, which is there's a separate low temperature water circuit just for the water to air coolers there that run on an electric pump. And I've been coining that as the beachfront property of the car. Front, center, first one, you get the most, coolest, highest pressure air you can. And then adding the hood extractor makes the flow through those even more efficient, less restrictive. And you can see the stall gurney in front of that. That creates high pressure on the front of it, low pressure on the back of it. So we're effectively then sucking the air out of there too. Once again, all in the name of cooling with a lot of aerodynamic benefits there as well. Sorry, what? So the question is around, does the oil change interval change because the turbo's in the engine? It does not. The oil change interval that the engine controller is monitoring is based on temperature you started at for oil contamination, time at temperature, crank revolutions. It's really looking at what the life the oil has, temperature-wise, and crank revolutions, and that's really what factors into the oil. What's the question? Is the oil type? It's the same as the LT6 with 5W50. That's a supercar.
Regular warranty?
Regular warranty, like every other series.
Anything in the trunk that's not going to melt, or is it?
You can put aluminum in there and it won't melt. The trunk will keep your pizza warm. Ooh, thank you. I did not go that far down that rabbit hole. Yeah, so with the LT7 intake manifold, we have added a PFI fuel system. We did that as well in the previous generation ZR1 with the LT5. However, in that system, we only use those 4 fuel injectors for supplemental or top-end fuel. Obviously, we need those here at full bore. All 16 injectors are basically running their max pulse width to feed it. Which, other fun fact, if you could hold peak power, which you need a relatively long runway, the engine will consume almost 2 gallons of gas to make that 1,000 plus horsepower. So that's a weird thing we're at right. But with the 2 fuel systems, what we do different on this is we use it as a true PDI system, we call it, port direct injection. So we blend the 2 throughout the operation. For example, when you start up in a cold start, you go into catalyst slide off, determining that's how it sounds. We're 100% DI like we are in the LT6. We do stratified charge, we keep the cat and all those good things. But after the engine warms up into that outlet, we'll actually transition to 100% PFI. It's quieter, and also there's a lot of emissions benefits to using DI versus PFI in different conditions. So as you drive the car up the load range, we'll blend the 2 or use all one or use all the other. So we use the systems very dynamically.
You talk about the variable valve timing that they're using in this as opposed to some of the other models.
So from a cam phaser perspective, the LT6 and LT7 are the same. We have the same phasing authority and exhaust intake. We have retimed the loads to the cams differently, just so where we're using that phasing is more optimized for where we want to go for boost. There's a balance in naturally aspirated and boosted. You want where you want overlap for tuning or where you want overlap for scavenging, but it does have unique timing and unique valve profile lift that's optimized for a boosted engine. So the question is around the exhaust looks the same between the Z06 and the ZR1. They are very similar. And once again, we were always planning on doing this, so some of it was future protected, but there are some different components in the exhaust to handle the increased temperature and flow rate, more from a structural point of view than really a flow. With the valves open in the center exhaust, it's as close to a straight pipe as you can get today, so the back pressure is really low. The LT6 and the LT7 both do not have cylinder reactivation. Keep that one simple.
Crazy.
Question is, what kinds of engine efficiency? You look at like brake specific fuel consumption. I would have to get a computer out before I quote exact numbers. We're tickling into the 30s, but I don't know. I don't have a number to quote on that on the LT7. I'll say this though, it was designed for power as its primary mission, and everything else will be what it's going to do. Oh, yeah, we were talking about that earlier. So, back to validation requirements, and we treat this engine like any of the other C8 engines you see here with factory warranty, durability requirements, and things like that. With these engines, we do something which is much more fun to listen to than a normal validation test. We actually have recordings of our, I call them professional race drivers that run our vehicle performance group for the Corvette on our Milford Road course, and last time they ran the Nürburgring. We stitched 2 of those laps together, and we run it in a dyno, where we can run it for 50, 60, 70 hours straight. So when we say we can stand by this engine, we can say we can stand by this engine, and from having worked on it a long time, I'll admit, about every time we run in one of these, there's a bunch of people just standing by the door, just listening, because you can just feel it. The dyno is wild how it can actually simulate the gear shifts. It's that quick to react to it. So it's in there just singing away up to it, and you hear depth go decelerate down, and then a long sustained backstretch on the vertical part of it, and you can see the exhaust just start to blow red hot as they approach 200 miles in each stretch. Yes, sir. You can expect delivery sometime next year. Yeah, I can help.
Not that anybody would want to, but there's a bunch of exhaust companies here. Is it going to be easily upgraded if you wanted to throw on top of it?
I personally really like this exhaust. I think the team did a bang up job on it. So personally, I wouldn't muck with it, but the rear of the car is configured the same between the ZR1 and the Z06, so you can do what you want to from there. Anything else I forgot that you guys can remember? Huh? I don't know if we're allowed to start.
There you are.
Josh, are we allowed to start it, or does Zach get that? I don't even. We've been struggling with it because everybody tries to open the doors and it's kind of bad. So, I'll follow up on that so we can. I don't have the keys. Or the authority. Alright, last call, anything? Otherwise, a bunch of us will be here if you want to talk about anything more specific, or if you're here to hang out and talk about it for a while. Cool, thanks everybody.